My wife betrayed me with my best friend while I was at work, so I destroyed his life by getting him sent to jail and left her without a home. Background: brace yourself for some sadness. My wife, Amanda, and I were raised in a town of around 30,000 people. We met at a young age, probably around 6 or 7, though I can't remember exactly. From then on, we were almost inseparable. By the time we turned 16, we started dating, and at 18, we moved to a city just a few hours away for work. At 20, we got married and bought our first home. Then, at 22, we discovered we were expecting a baby boy. When tragedy struck. About 5 weeks before Amanda was supposed to go on maternity leave, a massive shelving unit at her workplace collapsed and crushed her. I was told that both she and our unborn child died instantly. 2 of her colleagues were also injured in the accident. One was left paralyzed, and the other lost a leg, which had to be amputated. The company she worked for had decided, as a cost-cutting measure, to keep using old shelving that had been declared unsafe instead of replacing it. To this day, I still can't fully forgive the executives and managers who made that decision, because it took away the love of my life and our unborn child. Not long after, I was given what they called a choice on how to proceed with what her company referred to as compensation, but to me, it was just blood money. They wanted to settle out of court to avoid a lawsuit, but I was determined to make them pay. Just to clarify, this isn't the revenge part, this is still background. Thankfully, due to the media coverage and the involvement of several politicians, the case was settled in court within about 3 years. The payout for all parties was nearly 10 times what they initially offered. The company faced numerous fines for workplace safety violations, and several executives were fired or jailed. That's a story for another time, maybe, when I feel ready to share it. During all of this, I continued working my job in telecommunications. My mother, bless her soul, moved in with me during this time to help out. Honestly, I think I would have fallen apart if she hadn't been there for me. Around this time, I was offered a promotion, but it involved a lot of travel across the state. I requested to have an office in my hometown S branch so I could manage business both statewide and locally, as there was no business representative in my hometown. Thankfully, they agreed. After a few months, I settled into a routine 1 to 2 weeks in the city office, 1 week in my hometown, and 1 to 2 weeks visiting the rest of the state. A year later, I decided to buy a house in my hometown, so I wouldn't have to stay at my parents' place whenever I was home, and could have the freedom to come and go as I pleased. This detail will be important later in the story. Our story really begins about 4 years later. Apologies if the backstory was a bit lengthy. One Friday, after returning from one of my trips, I was checking in some things at my office when Harry, the branch S managing director, walked in. Harry and I had known each other since childhood, though we went to different schools. Since my return to the hometown, we had developed a close friendship. He asked how I was doing and then invited me to a house party he was hosting that evening. It was a bit last minute, but I figured a few drinks with friends wouldn't hurt, so I agreed. That evening, Harry introduced me to Catherine. She was a new hire at the branch where my hometown office was located, and she was getting to know everyone since she was new in town. We clicked right away. I know it sounds cliche, but it felt like Amanda was standing right in front of me again, except it was Catherine. I want to bore you with too many details, but after 2 years of dating, Catherine and I decided to take the next step, and she moved into my house in the hometown. Everything seemed to be going well. Catherine got along with my parents, and Amanda's parents were happy that someone could bring me as much joy as Amanda had. Things were smooth for nearly a year, but then they started to change. Skype calls were suddenly cut short. Neighbors mentioned seeing a car that looked a lot like Harry's parked in the back alley near my house whenever I was away, and I found clothes in my wardrobe that weren't mine. All signs pointed to cheating, but Catherine assured me nothing was going on. She explained that Harry would occasionally come over to discuss work, but never stayed the night. I chalked it up to paranoia and carried on as if nothing was wrong, but something deep down just didn't feel right. About 6 months later, I discovered that she had been lying to me. I had just closed a big contract with a new company, and the negotiations wrapped up sooner than expected. Instead of sticking around for the next few days, I decided to catch an early flight home and surprise everyone. A few hours later, I arrived in my hometown and drove down the alley behind my house to sneak in and surprise Catherine. But part of me was curious to see if that mystery car was there. Sure enough, there was a car blocking the back entrance gate. At first, I thought it might just be a careless neighbor, but then I realized it was Harry S. car. If it weren't for the tall hedges I had planted a few years back for privacy, I might have driven right past my own place without noticing. I pulled up behind his car, got out, and found it odd that he was still there so late, especially since Catherine had assured me he always left by now. As I approached the back of the house, my stomach dropped. There, in my kitchen, I saw Catherine and Harry going at it, completely engrossed in each other. I froze. Time stood still. There was my close friend, having sex with my girlfriend on our kitchen counter. I didn't know what to do. A flood of questions raced through my mind. Was this real or was I imagining things? Why were they having sex in my house? Feeling utterly defeated, I turned around and left without them noticing. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, crying uncontrollably. But the sadness quickly turned into a burning anger, the same kind I had felt toward those responsible for Amanda S.'s death. I wanted to hurt them, to make them suffer. But as a pacifist, I didn't believe in violence. That S when I knew I was going to punish them and ruin their lives. And what better time to start than right now? I moved my car further up the alley, just far enough away from my driveway so I could still see Harry S. car, and then I walked back to the gate where I could see into the house. I called Catherine S. phone. They were still at it when it rang. They both looked at the caller ID and did a double take when my name appeared. I could see Catherine debating whether to answer, but they let it ring out. After a few moments, they resumed their activities, so I dialed her number again. This time she answered. As soon as she did, I hung up and walked back to my car. She called me back almost immediately, asking why I was calling so late. I told her I was about 10 minutes from home and didn't want to scare her by arriving unannounced. She sounded shocked but pretended to be happy that I was coming home. The call ended quickly after she said she was going to change into something else. I said goodbye and hung up. A few moments later, Harry came tearing out of the gate, still half-dressed, and jumped into his car, speeding off like a bat out of hell. I couldn't help but smile a little, knowing the fear they must have felt, thinking they were so close to being caught. I waited a few moments before pulling my car into the same spot where Harry had just been. The rest of the night was uneventful, but after Catherine fell asleep, I got up and went to my office down the hall. I couldn't sleep. I needed to plan. And plan I did. The revenge. My mother always taught me to be a pacifist and let karma take care of things. But this time, I decided karma could use a little push. I was going to punish them separately, but I was determined to destroy them both. I knew Harry had a drug habit, nothing major, but something he kept very private. I had only found out by accident after seeing some coke and weed at his place, though I pretended not to notice when he hastily tried to cover it up. I reached out to some of my more unsavory clients and discreetly asked if they had any samples they could spare. A few days later, I had a decent stash, enough to set my plan in motion. About a month later, I invited some friends, including Harry, over for a barbecue night. After making sure Harry was thoroughly liquored up, I suggested he stay the night and sleep it off. In the early hours of the morning, I took the drugs and a few personal items of mine and stashed them in various spots around his car, placing the largest stash in the tire well. Confident that he wouldn't find them over the next few months as my plan unfolded, I locked his car and went inside to sleep. Later, I also planted some drugs and personal items in his house after driving him home, as he was still too drunk to drive himself. A few days later, I staged a break-in by smashing the back window of my kitchen door and leaving it open before heading back to the city for a flight. As soon as I landed, I had several messages waiting for me. One was from my clearly panicked mom, who had found the back door smashed open and called the police. Another was from a tearful Catherine, and the last was from the local police asking me to call them. After returning all the calls, I informed the police that I was away on business and would be back the following week to talk with them. While I was away, I asked Catherine to stay with my parents until I got back, and I had my dad arrange for a local security company to install cameras and an alarm system after getting the go-ahead from the police to ensure the crime scene wasn't compromised. Once I returned home, I put on the usual act I can to believe this happened. And why would someone do this? All the while playing the part of the shocked and concerned homeowner. After a thorough check of the house, I discovered that the items I had taken were missing and filed a police report. The security company's representative then walked Catherine and me through how the cameras and alarm system worked. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the question about what to do if we didn't want certain activities recorded. Catherine seemed a bit shy asking, but I knew exactly why she was curious. The rep assured us this was a common question, and he showed us how to disable recording on specific cameras if we needed to, protect her modesty. As I walked him out, I casually asked if we could get notifications if any cameras were turned off, just as an extra security measure. He happily came back inside and helped me set up email alerts before leaving. Perfect. All I had to do now was wait. At this point, I reached out to her legal advice for some guidance on couples law in my country. I wanted to be sure that my upcoming plan was legally sound and that I wouldn't be forced to pay Catherine any money or equity. I wasn't sure if we were considered a de facto couple or not, and as the sole beneficiary of Amanda's estate, I couldn't afford any nasty surprises. A big shout out to the folks there. They helped me connect with a fantastic lawyer. He assured me that even though Catherine and I had been dating for nearly 4 years, we hadn't lived together long enough to be classified as de facto. Plus, since I was paying all the utilities on the property where she lived and she wasn't paying rent, she had no legal standing to make any financial claims against me. Just to be safe, he drafted a pretty ironclad document in case any legal trouble arose. The following week, my work approached me with a promotion offer to move back to the city and lead the team I was part of. This meant I wouldn't have to travel as much and could stay in one place, while the success of my role in my hometown had them considering sending 3 to 5 representatives to spend 1 to 2 weeks in the larger surrounding towns, including my hometown, as part of my team. I accepted the offer and began the transfer process, which would take about 6 weeks. Perfect. This gave me more than enough time to gather all the evidence I needed. Upon returning to my hometown the following week, I set the rest of my plan in motion. I asked Harry to approve a week's vacation for Catherine in 2 weeks' time. I told him I wanted to send her and a couple of friends on a retreat before I made the biggest decision of my life for the second time. Harry jumped up and gave me a huge hug, congratulating me on being ready to take the plunge again. I hugged him back tightly, though not in the way he probably imagined at the time. He agreed to block out the week and promised not to say anything to anyone, as I wanted it to be a big surprise. Of course, I knew word would spread around the office regardless, but that was all part of my plan. That night, I told Catherine that I had booked her and 2 friends a week-long trip to a tropical spa resort. All expenses paid. No questions asked. Just pick 2 friends and come back to the biggest surprise of her life. She screamed with excitement like a kid who had just been told they could have all the candy in the shop. I then mentioned that the following week, I would be in the city preparing for a large client, one of my biggest accounts, and that I needed some of my team members to help. I told her I'd be flying out the following week and wouldn't be home until the Monday she was leaving, so I wouldn't get to see her before she left. She seemed a bit disappointed, but I reassured her that it would all be worth it when she got back. What I didn't tell her was that I had decided to take 2 weeks of vacation on the other side of the country, mentally preparing myself for the chaos that was about to unfold the moment she stepped onto that plane and enjoying my first taste of freedom. Rewritten version 2 weeks later, on a Sunday, I flew back and started driving home. As I passed by the house, sure enough, Harry's car was parked out front. Just like the first night I caught them, I parked a little further back and checked the cameras. There they were, asleep in my bed. It wasn't a shock. I had been recording them doing this regularly over the past 2 weeks while I was away. When I made my first move. I called the police, blocking my caller ID, and told them I was a concerned neighbor who had seen someone hanging around in their car in the alley behind my house, occasionally passing something through the windows to passing cars. I mentioned that I was worried they might be dealing drugs or planning to break into someone else's property. I gave them Harry S. license plate number and a description of his car. They said they'd send someone over in a few minutes, so I thanked them and hung up. Next, I called Catherine and told her I was about 10 minutes from home. I knew she was flying out the next day, but I wanted to surprise her. Looking back at the footage now, I can't help but laugh at the chaos that followed. Within seconds, Harry was half-dressed and bolting out the back door to his car. It couldn't have played out more perfectly. As Harry sped away, one of the police cars rounded the corner behind me, spotted Harry S. car, and gave chase. After pulling into my driveway, I was greeted by an excited Catherine. We did the usual couple stuff, and she eventually fell asleep again. I, on the other hand, couldn't sleep a wink. The next morning, Catherine and her friends were bundled into a car and headed off on their trip. After they left, I waited a few hours and then set my plan into motion. I called a friend of mine who is a removalist and apologized for the late notice, explaining that I needed my place packed and moved by Friday. We agreed on a time, and I instructed him to take certain boxes to a storage facility, which he said wouldn't be a problem. Then, I began packing up Catherine S. belongings. Later that day, I got a call from the police asking me to come in and identify some property they had recovered from a suspect the previous night. They said it matched the description of the items I had reported stolen. I couldn't help but grin, knowing that my plan to frame Harry was unfolding perfectly. I told them I'd be there shortly to collect the items. Naturally, a few of the items were still missing, most likely because they were still in Harry S. house, which hadn't been searched yet. By this time, word had spread throughout the entire town. In a small town like ours, secrets don't stay buried for long. Harry was humiliated and swiftly fired for having drugs and stolen property, and later in the week, both of our bosses issued a formal apology to me on behalf of the company. That night, I went to my parents' house and told both my parents and Amanda S. parents what had happened, leaving out certain details. I also explained that I was moving back to the city after being promoted, and that Catherine wouldn't be a part of it. They were initially upset that I hadn't let them know what was going on, but they were glad I was handling the situation maturely and hadn't stooped to Catherine and Harry S. level. They didn't completely agree with me ghosting Catherine, but after some drinks, laughs, and tears, they were more supportive. On Friday afternoon, after a hectic week of organizing cleaners for the following week, contacting the real estate agent to put my house on the rental market, and wrapping up various tasks at the hometown office, I packed some things into my car and drove to my parents' place to say goodbye before hitting the road. Before leaving town, I stopped by Becky S. house. Becky had been one of Amanda S.'s closest friends growing up, and the only person who knew what was happening, minus the details about Harry. Without her help, I wouldn't have been able to organize everything as quickly as I had. I handed Becky a large manila folder containing the evidence I had gathered of Catherine S. cheating, along with a letter and some legal documents from my attorney stating that Catherine was not to contact me and details about how to access her belongings at the storage unit I had rented. After a quick goodbye, I drove back to the city. On Sunday, I woke up to several missed calls, voicemails, and text messages. Turns out, Catherine had come home early after hearing rumors that something was up in town, only to find an empty house with a for rent sign out front. In a panic, she went to my parents' house, but they shut the door on her as soon as they answered, leaving her to call everyone she could think of until she finally managed to get in touch with Becky. Becky told her that she had a package for her. Needless to say, Catherine didn't take it well. By then, I knew exactly what to expect from the numerous angry texts and voicemails from her accusing me of setting Harry up, being deceitful, and more. I was worried she might show up at my front door, but nothing ever happened. Now, 5 weeks later, after being fired and promoted, I am writing this for you, dear reader. It's a long story, and I had to rewrite it several times to cut it in half, but I feel that most of what I shared was important to this story.